Hi everyone, welcome to this session on understanding the new National Flood Risk Assessment. As usual with these big online Zooms, we're going to wait just a couple of minutes to let everybody join before we kick off. I think we're expecting about 1,000 people on this, which seems remarkable to me, but that's what we think. And so we'll just give it a few minutes. But a very warm welcome to this session just as we begin. My name's Dr. Hugh Ellis and I'm Director of Policy at the TCPA. And the session today, I guess, is about an issue that is really, really critical to us, which I'll say a few more words in a second about. And also to say, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping in a second as well. Just as a sort of opening part of that housekeeping, if people have questions, because this is quite an important and potentially quite packed sessions, please put them in the Q&A. It will be enormously helpful to an old man like me if people resonate with a question that's already posted, if they could simply just like it, and then we can prioritize those, broadly speaking, for the end of the session. So let's just make a brief start, 2 minutes past. I know some people are still joining, so I'll speak quite closely. This session is designed from the TCPA and the Environment Agency, essentially to provide a platform for the agency to talk about a whole series of new resources and data, which is absolutely critical to the future of development planning and development management. The sort of structure of this session is a number of really great speakers from the Environment Agency, so it's a really high quality session. We're going to describe the various components and aspects of the new National Flood Risk Assessment process and the National Coastal Erosion Risk Mapping resources, and to understand the various different products and resources the Environment Agency are producing. I'm going to largely do that without comment, so speakers, to save time, will hand one to the other. And as I say, please put your questions in the Q&A. And here's the allowance for this. There are no stupid questions in this process. For those of us who've been around the planning for flood risk and climate change agenda, there is still so much of this in the detail of policy that I find hard to grasp. So please be open and honest about the questions. Whether you're at the beginning of your career or the end of it, there's actually still a tremendous amount to learn. So please put those questions in the Q&A. We've also got a number of polls just to keep it exciting. We'll do one in a second about people's understanding when we get started, and then there's sort of 3 others, and they're designed not to make this grey February day even greyer by giving you an exam, but just to test people's understanding of some key issues as we move forward. So let's move on, if we can, to the second slide, to that poll. So the first poll, which you should be able to see shortly, there we are, is just a really, really simple one. And if you can participate and fill them in, it's just really useful. It's partly really useful, actually, for us to understand what you understand, so that the agency and TCPA can shape resources and try to meet the sort of training and needs that are out there. So how confident are you in standing in NaFRA2 and NCERM? Extremely confident, somewhat confident, neutral, somewhat not confident, or extremely not confident. I know where I put my understanding at the beginning of this seminar, so let's just see how that goes. And we'll just give you 10-15 seconds to fill that in. It's a terrible shame that panelists can't vote, because I know where my vote would probably go, and it wouldn't be at the top. Okay, so just as that poll closes, great. There you go. Everyone can see where we are. Your poll pretty much reflects where I am personally. So let's look forward to the rest of this seminar. By the end of it, I'm personally looking forward to have a complete and perfect understanding of all of these issues. And in that regard, we'll move straight on to introduce Ben Plummer, Deputy Director of Strategy and Adaptation. Ben's just going to do some opening scene setting. Sorry, there is the agenda. I'll just quickly flick through it. You can see it's quite packed, so I won't dwell on it too much, but there's a whole series of really critical issues we'll work through. And then there is a Q&A at the bottom, which we hope to get to. Can I just say that we will try to capture the Q&A that you write. So it's really important that you do put those questions down. And whether we get to them all in this session, I doubt, frankly, but we will reflect on them both in the TCPA and in the Environment Agency to see how they might inform resources as they're produced. So Ben, please take us through the opening scene setter.
Thanks very much, and fantastic to see just how many people have joined this webinar. Actually, I would say great to see you all, but I can't see you on my screen with that many people here. But really good to see the interest in this really important update to our flood risk information that we're going to be talking about today. As I said, what's already been said, my name is Ben Plummer. I'm the Deputy Director for Strategy in the NCERM part of the Environment Agency. And I'm just going to give a bit of wider context on the EA's role in relation to the management of flood risk, just to help set the scene really for the webinar. And then I'll be passing over to the technical experts to share more detail on our new data and digital services and to answer any questions you may have. So if we just go on to the first slide, for those of you who aren't aware, and I'm sure there'll be some who aren't, the EA's principal purpose was set out in the 1995 Environment Act, and it's to enhance the environment so as to contribute to the objective of achieving sustainable development, which is a bit of a mouthful, but as part of that mission, we do play a direct role in managing flood risk from main rivers, from the sea, from estuaries. We build and maintain flood defences and other flood risk management infrastructure. And we also provide warning and informing services to let people know about their risk from those sources of flooding. Under the Flood and Water Management Act in 2010, we've also got a strategic overview on all sources of flooding, and that includes a statutory requirement to produce and deliver an NaFRA2 strategy, which you may well have seen, as well as providing national publicly available data and information on flooding and coastal change to inform decisions made by all risk management authorities involved in flood risk management. And it's mainly that part of our strategic overview role that is really most relevant to what we'll be discussing with you today, with the updates to our NCERM and NaFRA data and our related digital services. A good understanding of flood and coastal erosion risk is obviously the key first step, really, in managing flood risk effectively, including making informed decisions on the location and the design and whereabouts of new development. We've been producing national flood risk datasets to support planning decision makers, people working in planning, developers for a number of years. The data's co-evolved with planning policy. It started with quite a basic approach to managing present-day river and sea risk, and it's progressed to what we have today, which is a much more sophisticated approach that considers multiple sources of flooding, both for today and for the future. And much of our flood risk information has been continuously improved over time and will continue to be so. As a result, the planning system has now become quite accustomed to handling changes to our understanding of risk. If we just go to the next slide, you'll all be aware now that the government is seeking to deliver 1.5 million new sustainable homes across this parliament alongside economic growth. And we also know that protecting communities from flood risk remains a top government priority and in fact a contributor to that economic growth agenda. Our new data that the team will talk through in a moment should help instill greater confidence amongst planners and developers to pursue the right kind of development in the right places. And it should also help alleviate the current burden on developers and local planning authorities to undertake flood risk assessments, helping to speed up and smooth out the development management process whilst providing more certainty in terms of outcomes. If we just move to the next slide. It's been quite a long journey to get to where we are today with our NaFRA2 and NCERM information. You may already be aware that we published our national assessment of flood and coastal erosion risk in England on the 17th of December. And that gives our kind of national explanation, national summary of the current and future flood and coastal erosion risk in England using the new data that we've produced. We hit the second big launch milestone in late January, where we made the new risk of flooding from rivers and sea and risk of flooding from surface water information available on our digital Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk service, as well as our new national coastal erosion risk information as well. And I think John will be talking a little bit more about those data products in a moment. Looking ahead, our final big milestone, and the key one for, I'm sure for many people on this call, is on the 25th of March, where we'll be publishing additional new flood risk data, including updated flood zones, and we'll be updating the flood map for planning service as well as part of that process, which will show the new information. Lastly, before I hand over to John, if we just go to the final slide in the intro section, just to give a very kind of top level flavour of the headline figures from our national report. The data shows there are currently 6.3 million properties at risk of flooding from at least one of either rivers, sea or surface water. 3,500 properties are also now understood to be at risk of coastal erosion by the middle of the century under a present day climate scenario. And crucially, that figure assumes that the 20 shoreline management plans in place around the English coast are fully funded and delivered. Without those shoreline management plans, that figure could actually rise to more like something like 32,800 properties at risk by the middle of the century. So quite a good indicator of their importance, really, as documents. And lastly, we know that climate change will impact on flood and erosion risk in the future. By the middle of the century, we expect 8 million properties to be at risk of flooding from at least one of either rivers, sea or surface water. And even with the shoreline management plans delivered on the coast, there could be as many as 19,700 properties at risk of erosion in the period up to the end of the century when taking climate change into account, which is mainly due to the effects of sea level rise on erosion rates. Without any investment in the shoreline management plans, that figure is actually expected to be about 5 times greater. So those are the headline figures. The only one that's not showing in there is that surface water makes up a big proportion of that 6.3 million properties at risk. There has been quite an increase, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in the webinar, in the number of properties at risk from surface water flooding. I'm going to hand over now to John Hunt, who will share a bit more detail on what we've produced and our new flood risk information and why it represents such a substantial improvement in our understanding. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Ben. Yep, so over the next few slides, we'll introduce the new and updated datasets, where they'll be available, and also a bit more background to the new flood risk information in particular. So next slide, please. So we're making our new data available across several digital platforms. For each platform, we've selected those datasets we think best fit the platform's main users. So our Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk service is aimed at residents and businesses making short and medium-term decisions about preparing for a flood. Users can search by postcode and see the flood risk in their area of interest. Our Flood Map for Planning service, as you'll probably be familiar with, is aimed at planners and developers and those carrying out flood risk assessments, or FRAs, helping to inform the long-term decisions about the location and design of development required by planning policy. And we show our coastal erosion information on Shoreline Management Plan Explorer, or SMP Explorer, which you can also access from the Check Coastal Erosion Risk for an Area in England website. So those pages are aimed at planners, developers and coastal practitioners, but also members of the public. And all the data we publish on all of those services are available via the DaFRA Data Services platform. Next slide, please. So here you can see the summary of datasets we have published and are soon to publish across these different services. So in January, as Ben has mentioned, on the Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk service, we published updated maps and information for flooding from rivers, sea and surface water. There's new information indicating the possible impacts of climate change on future risk. And we're also showing more information about likely depths of flooding. A word of caution about using this data for planning purposes. The data sets on the Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk service have not been selected specifically for spatial planning, and we'll cover more detail on this later in the presentation. Also in January, we published new maps for coastal erosion risk on SMP Explorer. So that includes maps for future risk accounting for different coastal management and climate scenarios, as well as data on properties at risk from coastal erosion. Erosion risk can also be viewed alongside information from each shoreline management plan, and those set out the management approach and the action plan for managing coastal erosion risk in that area. And we'll go into a bit more detail about those new coastal erosion risk maps later on as well. On the 25th of March 2025, we'll publish new flood risk information on the Flood Map for Planning service. And that's obviously of a lot of interest to this audience. And Sam will be describing the changes to flood mapper planning in a lot more detail later on in this presentation. But for now, on the next slide, I'm going to briefly dive into flood risk specifically, and we'll look at how our new approach represents such a significant improvement in our understanding of flood risk. So our previous National Flood Risk Assessment, or NaFRA for short, it was an assessment of present-day flood risk, so it didn't consider the effects of climate change on future risk. It was difficult for us to update, so the original NaFRA was produced over 20 years ago now, in 2004. And since then, we've expanded and improved our existing assessment, but those updates were difficult to do. New local information was included in quarterly updates, but the last national update was completed in 2018. It used a low resolution, and there were inconsistencies between data sets which were produced in different ways. So some of those data sets also only used a national model, which isn't as reliable as detailed local risk assessments. So looking at our new National Flood Risk Assessment, or NaFRA2, firstly, it's not just one data set, it's a system that we've developed to produce all the different rivers, sea and surface water data sets. So previous NaFRA was just the risk of flooding from rivers and sea, but NaFRA2 is a system that will also produce the new flood zones and our new surface water maps, amongst other outputs. And the system combines detailed local modelling with national modelling to generate all our data sets, which brings much greater consistency. NaFRA2 is also improving our accuracy and precision as a whole. So we'll be using the best available local flood risk models in our national products. And those will also be supplemented by the new national modelling, which is a step change in our national flood risk modelling. So it uses the latest topographic data, it uses updated hydrology, it's able to map flood risk at a much higher resolution than previous national modelling. And it captures smaller watercourses than we were able to include in previous national modelling. So smaller watercourses will be included in the flood zones, for example, where we didn't previously include them because of limitations in national modelling. The system will also provide us with a greater range of information. So we've created national climate change outputs for the first time, for example, and NaFRA2 will provide many other outputs over time. This initial publication is just the start, with NaFRA2 giving us a lot more flexibility and efficiency. So in the future, we'll be able to update our maps more easily. We'll be able to track how our assessment of risk changes. We'll be able to create new scenarios and new types of outputs as needed, and much more. So all of this will help us meet the wide range of needs of internal and external customers who needed evidence to help make decisions about adaptation and resilience. So the next slide covers kind of what the NaFRA2 system is as a whole. So as I've said, NaFRA2 itself isn't a data set or a map, but it's a system that combines our growing stock of high quality local flood risk models with our best ever national flood risk modelling. So the system then creates a set of flood risk products, picking the best available combination of data for each. So it's the same system that will be used to produce each of our data sets, and each of those data sets are different. They meet different needs in different ways, but there's a consistency of approach across the whole. And it will enable us to provide new outputs in the future also, and also internally give Environment Agency staff new ways to probe flood risk so we can support customers and partners. And what we published in January and what we'll publish in March is the kind of first fruits of this new approach, which we'll keep improving and iterating. Obviously, one of the key data sets that we're updating with NaFRA2 is the flood zones. So I'll now pass to Andrew Pattinson to talk more about those changes.
Okay, so NaFRA2 will be used to update flood zones using a combination of the new national model alongside local detailed models. And the decision of which model to use is based on the quality of the data. Our initial analysis suggests the flood zones will not change very much at the national scale. Our new improved modelling does mean that in some areas our understanding of risk will change. So this means that for some areas the flood zones will grow and that for other areas they will shrink. Whilst we don't expect the total area covered by flood zones 2 and 3 to increase significantly, if at all, in locations where the flood zones do change and where that change corresponds with prospective development, this change will need to be accounted for. So we will continue to follow government guidance, which defines the flood zones and establishes the precautionary spirit in which they are produced. And our approach to defining the flood zones aims to ensure no significantly incorrect planning decisions are made as a consequence of our data. The flood zones are a composite data set which combines defended and undefended model runs alongside recorded flood outlines and any data produced by developers or local planning authorities, which have been accepted by the Environment Agency as representing a better understanding of risk than our own models. We have allowed several areas to retain older flood zone data where there was a strong case that the NaFRA2 information wasn't of sufficient quality and where a plan was already in place to produce better quality information in the next 18 months. To aid preparations for NaFRA2, we paused some flood zone updates for a period, and where new flood zone data has been produced during this period, there are local arrangements in place to ensure local planning authorities use the best available information. These outstanding updates will be incorporated into the published flood zones in the first significant updates, which are expected to start from the summer. We're improving the way we make our flood risk data available to customers through the flood map for planning and the flood products customers can access through that service. Some of that will be explained a bit later on. I'm now going to hand it over to Sam Kipling for more details.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to spend a bit more time now looking in some more detail at the planned improvements to the flood map for planning. Next slide, please. So on the 25th of March, 2025, hopefully, we'll be updating the flood zones to reflect both existing local models and the new and improved national model that you've heard about earlier. The flood zones are defined by government planning guidance and will continue to show present-day flood risk from rivers and sea, ignoring the benefits of existing flood defences. We'll also add layers showing river and sea flood extents with existing flood defences in place for both the present day and a climate change scenario. Among others, this will include a 1 in 30 defended scenario, which should help local planning authorities to identify functional floodplain, that's flood zone 3B, in strategic flood risk assessments. There's more detail on that to follow. Undefended river and sea flood extents will also be provided for both the present day and a climate change scenario. To map the possible impacts of climate change on future flood risk from rivers and sea, we followed our own climate change allowances guidance and selected a scenario and a time horizon which will be sufficient for most residential and commercial development types. It should be noted, though, that for some development proposals, additional climate change scenarios and time periods may still need to be assessed. And finally, we'll be displaying surface water flood risk extents on the flood map for planning for the first time, further raising the visibility of this important source of flooding to planners and developers. This will just be a present day scenario to start with, but we do expect to add a climate change scenario and depth information for surface water flood risk in due course. As with existing arrangements, the onus will continue to be on the users of the data, such as those undertaking flood risk assessments, to satisfy themselves that the data is fit for their intended use and is used appropriately. Next slide, please. The flood map for planning itself will look and feel quite different when the new data is published. Users will be able to explore an interactive map, toggling layers on and off for the different scenarios of interest. This combination of our new improved data with this more user-friendly and more accessible interface will represent a significant improvement for users, arming them with detailed information to inform decisions about the location and the design of new development. As before, users will still be able to draw around a site of interest and request more detailed flood risk data from us through the service. We've recorded a video with a demonstration of the service, which we'll share with attendees after the webinar, and that'll be via our SharePoint site. Next slide, please. The 25th of March just represents the start of the NaFRA2 information that we'll be making available that will help inform decisions on new development. We expect the first updates to start emerging from the summer, when we'll incorporate more local models, including those where the flood zone updates were paused during NaFRA2 preparations. In due course, we expect to add more information such as climate change scenario and depth information for surface water flood risk, and depth information for rivers and seas flooding. Over time, we will continue to improve the data and the flood map for planning functionality to make it even more useful and user-friendly for planners and developers. We do expect to provide quarterly updates of the flood risk information on the flood map for planning, but during the first year after publication, updates may be more or less frequent as we establish our new processes. Next slide, please. So how can you get ready for this change? So firstly, you'll need to prepare to add the data to your systems. So you're all set up to use it as soon as it's published. We do plan to release the flood zone data to local planning authorities 2 weeks in advance of publication. Some more details on this are provided later in the presentation. The updated flood zones will need to be used to check if the Environment Agency should be consulted. They should also be used to check if a proposed development type is incompatible with the flood zone and whether the exception test is needed. In addition to the flood zones, the new climate change scenarios for river and sea flooding and the new surface water information will need to be used to inform decisions about whether development proposals need a flood risk assessment, whether the sequential test is needed, and how they're applied. Please note that we're not publishing new data on residual flood risks, such as the consequences of flooding in the event of flood defence breach. Residual flood risks will still need to be assessed by those undertaking flood risk assessment, as planning policy requires residual risks to be safely managed. Government planning guidance encourages local authorities to produce a local ranking methodology to inform application of the sequential test. So please do start thinking now about if and how you might want to update your approach to the sequential test locally to make best use of the information that we're making available. As per previous arrangements, Environment Agency staff will look to support such conversations locally. We also know many of you will be wondering how the new information might affect local plan preparation and the need to update strategic flood risk assessments. A risk-based approach will need to be taken to decide whether further assessment or changes to proposed policies or allocations are needed. Local Environment Agency staff will also look to support conversations about the need for strategic flood risk assessment or local plan updates. We do provide more information on this topic later in the event. I'm now going to hand back to Hugh.
Thanks very much, Sam. We're going to do another quick quiz at this point, and which basically should just allow you a little bit of a pause so that you can just digest what you've just seen. So 2 quick questions. Do the flood zones account for climate change? And secondly, how early does the EA expect to release the updated flood zones to LPAs? And just as you respond to those, and again, the point of this, because I'm sure you might be asking, what is the point, is to help us understand what you understand and then direct resources to do that. And I would just also say on the call to my Environment Agency colleagues, wow, what a fantastic set of challenging questions have appeared in the Q&A. And if you want to try to respond to some of those, the shorter ones, then please do. I would say that at the moment, my general sense is that people are keen to understand, as you were just saying, Sam, what the resource implications and the kinds of level of work in terms of reviewing and updating SFRAs and local plans will be as a result of this data, but we'll come to that in the Q&A. So let's bring the poll to a close if we can, and see what responses we get. I'm not sure whether I'm still looking at the question. The challenge of having me chair anything that involves technology is normally this. So, do we have a response? Okay, then, that's gone really well. In which case, we will just gently move on, I think, and we'll wait to see what the response to that is in due course. What I'm going to do now is to hand on to Rachel Clark-Wood, if that's okay, if we can take the quiz down. Slightly conscious we're short of time, and we'll work out what went wrong with that. Who's going to talk about another really important aspect of all of this, which is new coastal erosion risk data, particularly in terms of some of our most vulnerable communities, a really significant issue. Rachel.
Thanks, Hugh. Hi, everyone. Yep, so as Hugh said, I am going to give you some detail on our newly released new NCERM data, so National Coastal Erosion Risk Map, which was released on the 28th of January. This evidence helps us better understand the risks associated with coastal erosion. And what I'll do, I will explain some key changes that we've made. But before I do that, it might be quite useful to actually set some context. So the Environment Agency, we have the coastal oversight role for the management of England's coastline. We do work in partnership with other organisations to achieve this, including through the preparation of shoreline management plans, also known as SMPs. SMPs, for those that don't know, have been refreshed over the last couple of years, including the launch of the new digital tool SMP Explorer. And as Ben said at the start of the call, that is where all the 20 English coastal SMPs are viewable and interactive via that digital tool. And this is also where the new NCERM data is viewable alongside those SMPs. So you've got all that information in one place. Next slide, please. I'll give some detail on the previous NCERM and also the updated NCERM. So as you can see on the slide there, our previous NCERM was produced back in 2012, and that only received 2 minor updates, and that was in 2015 and 2017. Our new coastal erosion risk map, sometimes referred to as NCERM2, has incorporated several big improvements. The project has made use of the best available data and methods that we can at that national scale, and it uses data collected by the National Coastal Monitoring Programme, which provides a really high resolution information of coastal change. We have used the latest climate scenarios on sea level rise with new modelling approaches to show the potential impacts on rates of erosion and on the deterioration of defences that prevent or reduce that erosion. Our approach has not allowed us to account for projected increases in rainfall and the subsequent impacts on groundwater and coastal landslides, and that's due to the inherent uncertainties and the complexity of doing so. The new NCERM projections use the new detail from the SMPs and the SMP refresh and uses those management intents to shape those erosion projections. And I'll go over some of that detail in the next slide. All of the data for NCERM has been thoroughly verified by local authorities, and that was during 2 rounds of engagement, and that totaled over 6 months worth of project time with a huge response rate. So a massive thanks to all of you that helped us to check that data. Our new information also provides an up-to-date picture of coastal erosion risk, which includes climate change impacts and provides a more comprehensive assessment of property types. And by hosting new NCERM on SMP Explorer, it is much more accessible than before. As with the previous NCERM, we expect the new data to be used by local planning authorities, preparing local plans, and also to inform the creation of new and updating existing coastal change management areas, or CCMAs. NCERM2 is likely to be a key piece of evidence, but in itself, it doesn't actually say where development is appropriate in light of coastal change risks. Next slide, please. So I'll just provide on this slide some detail on the combinations of the 3 variables that you can see there that actually formed NCERM's erosion risk scenarios. So in the first box, as you can see, the management scenario is taken from the SMPs. As a user, what you can do is either assume the SMP will be implemented or assume there will be no future intervention, and you can click that on and off on the tool itself. The second box there, the climate change scenario, users can select a present day climate where current rates of erosion are projected into the future, or 2 climate change scenarios of varying levels of precaution. And then finally, on the last box that you can see there, the time horizon, the user can select either the medium term to 2055 and the long term to 2105. And both of these time periods, again, are taken directly from the shoreline management plans. Next slide, please. I thought it'd be useful to actually show this. So it's a really good visual of what the project has actually achieved. As you can see on the image on the left, that was the previous NCERM, and then to the one on the right, which is the new NCERM as it sits on SMP Explorer. As you can see from this, it has made the product really easier to view and more intuitive, and shows the erosion data visually as areas of potential risk. It also provides supportive data and text to aid them better understanding, including specific help text on SMP Explorer itself. So there's various different links and also specific help topics for SMPs and the NCERM data. And the next slide, please. So finally, where can you actually find more information on NCERM? I've added links to all the places that you can view our new coastal erosion risk data and information on SMPs on the slide there. We'll also provide these post the webinar. You can also find all the comms and engagement products in the Coastal Handbook, including recordings of previous NCERM focus webinars. There's also the joint SharePoint page, which hosts a useful Q&A document with content dedicated to NCERM and its implications for development planning, as well as other useful guidance to our new data. We are also working with the TCPA on coastal planning webinars, including one for elected members, and they are to be held in late spring. So please do look out for those on the events page on the TCPA website. And that's all from me. So I'll hand over to Sam and Andrew, who are going to drill down some more into some of the key issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Much appreciated. So in the build up to this event, we've had some brilliant engagement from yourselves that's given us a really good insight into the key issues that are concerning you in relation to the new data. So we're going to do a bit of a deep dive in some of the key topics that have been identified in the build up to the event. So we're going to start with consultation arrangements. So the release of the new data, especially the climate change scenarios, might cause some confusion about whether consultation arrangements are changing as a result. We need to be really clear that consultation arrangements don't change as a result of the new data. The Environment Agency continues to be a statutory consultee on development in flood zones 2 and 3. And because the flood zones don't account for climate change, local authorities should continue to apply the standing advice process set out on gov.uk to determine whether or not the Environment Agency should be consulted. That standing advice is clear that if a site is in flood zone 1, but is considered to be at increased risk of flooding in future due to climate change, as shown within a local authority strategic flood risk assessment, the local authorities should apply the standing advice process to the site as if it were in flood zone 2. In most cases, this means standing advice would apply, but for some rarer development types, for things like essential infrastructure and highly vulnerable development, local authorities are asked to consult us. We're aware that several areas already have local flood risk standing advice in place. In most cases, these have been designed to work well alongside national flood risk standing advice and tend to be driven by local detailed data, so are likely to continue to work effectively. Our area teams, though, will review whether any changes are needed to local flood risk standing advice arrangements and will contact you if any changes are needed. Finally, regarding coastal change management areas, the new data will certainly help to inform the designation of coastal change management areas by local planning authorities in their local plans, but NCERM itself doesn't represent a coastal change management area. The Environment Agency is not a statutory consultee on development in coastal change management areas, but we do ask to be consulted on our external consultation checklist. Next slide, please. Displaying the new surface water data on the flood map for planning also has some potential to cause some confusion about our role on surface water flood risk, but our role isn't changing. So whilst the Environment Agency does continue to be a statutory consultee on development in areas that we've designated as having critical drainage problems, we have made clear in our Q&A document that the new data itself won't define areas with critical drainage problems, and there are no immediate plans for us to use the new data to define new or amend existing areas with critical drainage problems for development planning purposes. We currently only have such designations in Devon and Cornwall, and in each case, local standing advice is already in place. Lead local flood authorities will continue to be a statutory consultee on major development, and there's no suggestion from us that the new surface water data should be used to consult the Environment Agency or to consult the lead local flood authority for anything other than major development. It is, of course, for local planning authorities to discuss with lead local flood authorities whether they want to put in place any kind of local consultation arrangement which goes beyond this. We'll hopefully have a relatively brief period where the Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk Service contains some surface water data which is closer to what's needed in planning. This is because surface information, including climate change extents, have already been added to the Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk Service, whereas we're yet to finalise the data or a date for when the climate change scenarios for surface water will be added to the flood map for planning. However, please be aware that the surface water climate change and depth information on the Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk Service is not intended for use in planning. The time horizons and the climate change scenarios used are likely to fall short of what's needed to assess planned development. The depth data is also derived in a way which makes its use in planning unsuitable. Before more appropriate surface water data is added to the flood map for planning service, making it more of a one-stop shop for planners and developers, the information on the Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk Service on surface water might help to inform assessments, but we must caution against its use in isolation. Next slide, please. So another hot topic was functional floodplain. So we need to be clear that the flood map for planning will not map flood zone 3B, functional floodplain. Responsibility for doing so remains with local planning authorities in their strategic flood risk assessments. The new data will, however, be enormously helpful, we think, to help local authorities map functional floodplain, as it will allow them to do so more comprehensively rather than just in locations where we have detailed models, and it will help you to keep designations more up to date over time. If a strategic flood risk assessment is out of date, or it doesn't contain any data mapping functional floodplain in a location of interest, the 1 in 30 defended scenario could help to inform flood risk assessments to identify the likely presence or absence of functional floodplain or a level of risk commensurate with it. In such cases, we think it's appropriate for the onus to be put on the developer to undertake their own assessment of functional floodplain with reference to our new data. We do intend to update our How to Prepare a Strategic Flood Risk Assessment guidance on gov.uk to steer how local authorities should use the new data to help to map functional floodplain. The guidance might allow an approach where strategic flood risk assessments defer to data hosted on the flood map for planning rather than mapping it within the SFRA itself, provided such an approach is agreed locally. This would, of course, have the advantage of being more visible to planners and developers and would ensure functional floodplain extents are updated as any new data emerges. Next slide, please. So both NaFRA2 and NCERM2 follow our own current climate change allowances guidance. These are based on the current UK CP18 science and relate approximately to a 4 degrees warmer world by 2100. This means the allowances are in line with the guidance used for most planning applications. However, please be aware that for some developments, there may be a need to carry out further assessments of the impacts of climate change. 2 examples are for nationally significant infrastructure projects that may need to consider a credible maximum scenario as set out in relevant national policy statements, but also developments with significantly longer or shorter lifetimes than the time horizons we've used on the Flood Map for Planning service. I'm now going to hand to Andrew Simpson for some more information on strategic flood risk assessments and how to handle site-specific planning applications. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Sam, and hi, everyone. So yeah, first I'm going to talk about strategic flood risk assessments, or SFRAs. So we know many of you are already contending with recent revisions to the NPPF and may already be planning local plan reviews and updates to SFRAs as a consequence of this. Our hope is that our new data arrives at a helpful time to support this work. Our SFRA guidance and good practice guide already help planners prepare SFRAs and includes guidance on when to review or update them. We're confident our new data will improve both the quality and the coverage of SFRAs, whilst making them cheaper and easier for you to prepare and also maintain. The new data should also help you improve how you apply the sequential test, both to local plans and also planning applications, by informing an update to your local ranking methodologies used to compare relative flood risk between sites. In a lot of cases, our understanding of risk won't change very much, and even where it does, this is only likely to cause problems where changes coincide with areas subject to development pressure. Where this does occur, we're advocating a risk-based approach be taken to deciding whether SFRA updates or changes to policies or allocations are needed based on the nature and degree of change. Because further updates to data are anticipated, it's more important than ever that SFRAs are prepared in a way which makes them living documents, which are straightforward to keep up to date over time, as set out in guidance. Local planning authorities can seek advice from our area teams on the need to review and update their SFRAs, existing local plans, or those that are already in the process of preparation. We're asking our staff to give priority to those plans at critical stages of preparation, particularly those already under examination. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk about the early release of data. So we know that many of you would like the new flood zone data as soon as possible. And as Sam mentioned earlier, our plan is to release the flood zone data to local planning authorities 2 weeks before publication. This means our target date is the 11th of March, 2025. And I would encourage you to forewarn your data leads and local validation teams to ensure they're ready to receive, test, and start using the data from the 11th of March. We plan to share the links to the new data in several ways. They will be added to our SharePoint site. Details of how to access this will be shared with you. We will be also asking our area sustainable places teams to email out to all the local planning authorities locally. So please look out for this in the coming weeks. We intend to switch off the data feeds to the old flood zones on the 25th of March, but they will still be available for download, albeit marked retired, for 1 month after publication. This will allow you to compare and contrast the old and new data to identify whether changes coincide with prospective development. We encourage you to download the old flood zone dataset if you'd like to retain this for comparability beyond that 1 month period. We will not be releasing the other flood map for planning data before full publication. So links to all these new data sets will be available from the DEFRA Data Services platform from the 25th of March, 2025. Next slide, please. Thank you. Moving on to live applications and appeals. Many of you have asked us what the new data means for live cases. So local planning authorities can use the new data as soon as you receive it, but certainly no data than that full publication date. That means using it to screen all new and existing applications against the new data to ensure the Environment Agency have been appropriately consulted, flood risk assessments requested, and the sequential and exception tests appropriately applied. This approach would apply to all relevant application types. If, as a result of the new data, you need to issue consultations for cases which are at an advanced stage, please clearly mark those consultations urgent and explain why, and we will try to treat these as a priority. If you've already consulted the EA for flood risk advice or already received a flood risk advice from us, there should be no need to reconsult us unless you're particularly concerned about the validity of our advice. If you do choose to reconsult us on particularly high-risk cases, you should clearly mark why reconsultation has taken place. At the Environment Agency, our teams will start screening consultations against the new data as soon as we release it to local planning authorities. Whilst we won't be asking our staff to revisit cases we've already provided flood risk advice on, if we do receive reconsultations that are clearly marked as due to the data change, we will try to prioritize these and will either amend or reaffirm previous advice in writing. When local planning authorities and lead local flood authorities have local consultation arrangements in place, which go beyond consultation on major development, the implications of the new data on these arrangements will need to be discussed and any transitional arrangements agreed between local planning authorities and lead local flood authorities locally. A quick note on pre-application advice. We have started highlighting to developers at pre-app stage that new data is coming. We would encourage you to do the same for any pre-app advice you're providing. And then finally, we're aware that the new data may have implications for a small number of live planning appeals. We've briefed the Planning Inspectorate so they're aware that the new data is coming, and where relevant, consideration of whether the new data brings about the need for further assessments, revised evidence, or additional hearings may be needed. Local planning authorities and the Planning Inspectorate can contact our local teams for advice on specific cases as necessary. That's all from me, so I'm going to hand back to Hugh now.
Thanks very much, everyone, for that. And now we've got another quick quiz. I'm just going to say before we start that, if people could like and prioritize questions that are in the Q&A, that would be great. Although having said that, I've just tried to do that and can't find a way of doing it. So far, I think I'm really grateful to Environment Agency colleagues who've answered about half of them, and recognise some of them have actually sort of been dealt with through presentations. But please, as we sort of reach this point in about 10 minutes before the Q&A starts, if there's priority questions you want dealt with, other than the ones I shall try and glean from what you've said, then please shout in the Q&A. So this is poll three quick questions. Again, I'm going to ask Sam to perhaps help with this, particularly if I can't see the results as I couldn't last time for some reason. So 3 quick questions with the poll open. Will the flood map for planning show functional floodplain? It's a yes or no. Should LPAs consult lead local flood authorities on all development in areas at risk of surface water flooding? And then finally, should LPAs reconsult the EA and all live planning applications once the new data is published? And I think, Sam, just while we wait for those results to come in, it's interesting to see in the Q&A that there's quite a lot of uncertainty, I think, about how to deal with applications that bridge across this new data, and also the strategic flood risk assessment process that bridges across, and development planning that goes with it. And perhaps in a little while when we start the Q&A, I could ask Environment Agency colleagues if they could clarify some of that. I guess just as this poll comes to an end, I get a sense from the questions that we all know both the agency and local government are under so much capacity and skills pressure at the moment that this is immensely challenging, isn't it? I think we should all be quite honest about that. It's actually very difficult to see how we grapple with it. At the same time, it is very significant. So Sam, look, for whatever reason, I can't see the results of the poll coming in yet. And I still can't, so perhaps you can.
I can't, unfortunately, but I can talk through the questions, if that would be helpful, Hugh. Just
quickly, I think particularly because this is these 3 on this particular poll are probably the most detailed. So if you really could, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question is about functional floodplain. Hopefully we've been clear that the flood map for planning will not identify flood zone 3B. The responsibility for doing that remains with local planning authorities in their strategic flood risk assessments. But we do hope the new data will massively help local authorities to do that. The second question is about consultation arrangements with lead local flood authorities. It's a straight no to that one, certainly unless it's agreed locally between relevant local planning authorities and lead local flood authorities. LLFAs are only a stat consultee on major development. So if local consultations want to go beyond that, it needs to be discussed and agreed locally. And finally, the question about live planning applications. So appreciate there's quite a lot of nuance to the live planning applications. We do hope to add a sort of dedicated briefing note on this topic to our SharePoint site. So do look out for that over the next week or so. We are saying that local authorities will need to screen all new and live applications against the new data to ensure that the Environment Agency has been appropriately consulted, flood risk assessments requested, and the sequential and exception tests appropriately applied. The standing advice process, as set out on gov.uk, should be applied as normal, but using the new data. If you've already consulted the agency for flood risk advice or already received that advice, there shouldn't be a need to reconsult us unless you're particularly concerned about the validity of the advice we've provided. And in those cases, it's probably sensible to reach out to our area sustainable places teams to have a conversation about whether reconsultation is needed, rather than just sending things through to us. Hopefully that's clear, Hugh.
That is, thanks, Sam. We might come back to some of those themes in the Q&A. And now I think, so thank you for your responses. And now in this double act, we're passing to someone called Sam Kipling. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, so I'd like to take a moment to reflect on how we're going about communicating these changes and the support we're offering. Today's brilliantly attended webinar is one of the key milestones in the communication and engagement that we're doing, but there's lots of other stuff that I'd like to make you aware of as well. We have shared an enormous amount of information with you today. I really hope it's helped you to better understand the new information and to start digesting what it might mean for your work on development planning. But you would be forgiven for feeling a little daunted by it all. It's certainly a lot to take in. We really do think, though, that whilst our new data might cause a little bit of short-term pain as we all get used to it, we do think it will also create huge amounts of long-term gain by better informing decisions about development, whilst alleviating the burden on those undertaking flood risk assessments, hopefully resulting in a more certain and predictable planning system. And we are here to support you through this transition. A lot of support has already been provided to local authorities, including the webinar that we ran back in November, that was attended by over 600 people. So we've broken that record today, I'm pleased to say. A SharePoint site with a comprehensive Q&A document has been provided, as well as monthly roundups and briefing notes. Please note, in case you haven't accessed the SharePoint site already, you will need to register the first time you do it, and access will only normally be granted to those working for local authorities or for risk management authorities. We've already briefed the Planning Inspectorate, as mentioned, and anticipating the potential impact of the new data on live nationally significant infrastructure projects. We will be writing to those developers to highlight the new data and to provide clarity about how they should account for it. We also plan to provide you, local planning authorities, with briefing materials for developers, which can be shared through local developer forums. We've had feedback that that's likely to be the best way of getting briefing materials to developers locally. So look out for those on the SharePoint site. Ahead of publication, we also expect to add to the list of e-learning modules that are freely available through the TCPA's Learning Hub, covering modules on strategic flood risk assessments and how to account for flood risk in local plan preparation. In due course, we also expect to add a module on the topic of coastal change. In coming months, to complement our new data, we hope to publish new national templates for both flood risk assessments and sustainable drainage systems, helping to improve standardization and providing more clarity for developers on the information they need to provide you in their planning applications. The slide does include links to several other pieces of guidance and support that might be helpful to get you up to speed with the new information. In particular, if you haven't done so already, please do access and explore all the information that's on that SharePoint page for local authorities and risk management authority, as there's a plethora of other support there already, with more still to come. Finally, a plea, which I'm sure Hugh will repeat as well, do fill in the feedback form to let us know if there's any further support or guidance you'd like us to provide. Finally, huge thanks for your attendance and engagement today. It's greatly appreciated. Back to Hugh for our Q&A session.
Thanks very much. So we're just going to take a few questions and answers if we can. I mean, there is an enormous amount of material which is now lodged on the Q&A. I think we've had sort of close on 100 questions from people, and it's very difficult to sift and prioritize. So I'm going to take the liberty, the Environment Agency team, of pulling out 4 or 5 key themes that I can see represented there rather than doing them individually. So for those of you who are on the Environment Agency team and you want to turn your cameras on, that's always nice if you want to be part of the Q&A response. The first one is just to go from big picture to detail. There's actually quite a lot of questions there about how people access the SharePoint resources. It seems like a quick technical question that someone might be able to answer.
Yes, we will put something in the chat which explains the link and the registration process that people need to go through the first time they access the site. So please do keep an eye on the chat.
And I think it's already there, actually. So thank you, Ruth, for doing
Fantastic.
that. Apologies, I can't keep up. Can I put a bigger scenario which reflects a series of sort of concerns I can see about those people doing SFRAs and local plans, which is the expectation about updating them. So the scenario I'm going to put to you tries to reflect a number of concerns. Here I am with my SFRA. You know, I updated it, let's say in December 2024. You now publish all of this new guidance. What's your expectation about what I should be doing with that update? And can you provide as much clarity and certainty about what people should be doing with that, particularly in the context, I imagine, of severe resource constraints?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I'll take that, I think. So firstly, just to acknowledge that we're aware that local authorities are already contending with the December's updated National Planning Policy Framework and maybe starting to think now about local plan reviews and updates. Our hope is that this data lands at a helpful time while local authorities think about the prospects of their existing local plans, or perhaps those that are in preparation, hopefully helping them to assemble or update existing strategic flood risk assessments to inform those local plan processes. There isn't a one-size-fits-all position that we can take on whether an SFRA update is needed here as a result of the new information. We're going to have to take each one locally. We're advocating a risk-based approach be taken based on the degree of change and its consequences for prospective development. As Andrew Pattinson alluded, we don't expect the flood zones to change significantly at a national scale. The small changes that we do see, it will very much depend whether those changes coincide with prospective development. We are making the new data available early to get local authorities looking at the new data and comparing it with the old data and starting to form a view on what it might mean for local plan updates and SFRA updates as soon as possible. We will just be making the data available as data feeds from the 11th of March, but the data will be available for download from the 25th of March. And as we've said, for a month after that to allow that comparison to take place. But as we've said, our area staff will make themselves available to local authorities to help them digest the new information and take a view on whether a local plan or SFRA updates are needed as a consequence of the new data.
I really appreciate that, Sam. I recognise it's complex, but I'm going to torture you further for the local plan example. So you've been relatively clear about strategic flood risk assessments, but with a local plan prepared on previous data under the previous system, my provocation to you is, well, on the 25th of March, that plan is now out of date. And how do you make decisions based on a plan that's out of date? Because the data in it is plainly, is plainly relates to a system that has disappeared. So what advice are we giving in this really quite pressured environment on local plan making to those people who are at an advanced stage of local plan prep? And then suddenly this data, if you like, has changed. And I guess you've already been very clear that the data itself may not have in practice changed dramatically, but still you still have to review and look at it, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll need a period of taking stock of the changes and what their relationship is locally to existing local plans and other prospective development. Andrew helpfully described how the flood zones are put together. It's in two components. One is the local detailed models, and the other component is our new national model. The component which is the local detailed models, which tends to coincide with areas of development pressure, because we tend to improve our flood risk information in locations where there are lots of receptors for flood risk. That component of the flood zones is largely unchanged. So there's a good chance that the changes won't be enormously significant for developments. But as I say, each one would have to be taken in turn, Hugh, and we're there to support local authorities to do that digesting.
But I'm right to say that that work needs to be done. I mean, you know, it's either out of date or it isn't, and it is now. So that work has to be done, painful though it might be. Please, Environment Agency colleagues, could we just clarify the request to the SharePoint? There's quite a lot of Q&A debate going on there about whether we've accessed the right site. I can't help with that at all, but if people could look at it and just make sure that people on the call have got the right information, that would be really good. I'm just going to pick up a question about the development community. There's a number of questions about whether developers, and in fact, what I'm going to call others really, like parish councils, town and parish councils, and one or two questions about, you know, the wider implications in terms of social justice of this mapping, you know, whether it relates actually to the degree of resilience and accessibility of property. The communication with developers, you said, would happen locally. But can I ask you honestly whether you think the development sector gets this and the sort of scale of what the Environment Agency might try to do to communicate it?
Yeah, sure. So we are trying to reach developers. It's a disparate and large and complex audience to reach in one nice, convenient webinar like this. We took advice from an adept planning group on the best ways to reach that developers community. And the advice given was that the most local authorities have a local developer forum, which is a great platform to reach developers in that local area. Our intention is to provide with local planning authorities with a bundle of materials that can be used locally to brief developers via those forums. We are reaching out nationally to developer audiences at that national scale, but because the devil's in the detail of this new flood risk information, those local conversations are most likely to be the best ways of reaching those developer communities. The other big audience that we're trying to target as well, Hugh, is the community of consultancies who we rely upon for undertaking site-specific and strategic flood risk assessments. Our local area sustainable places teams often have a list of local flood risk assessment consultants, and we're likely to use some of the same briefing materials to try and reach that audience as well, conscious that they need to be aware of the data and to start using it in flood risk assessments as soon as it's published. But I would welcome any other feedback about other ways and means that we can reach that large and complex group of developers that we know need to understand and hear about this new flood risk information. So suggestions welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And I'm just saying as we answer questions, there are still responses, which I think are really important for us to capture, about clarity of submission of local plans and what inspectors might do and what the data should be. But I want to also link that together with the planning balance and funding for infrastructure, which has been raised a number of times in the questions. But so I'm going to put a proposition to you, Sam, and you can tell me I'm wrong, as I often am. But even if you have a local plan submitted, you need to take regard of the new data, regardless of whether the SFRA has been updated or not. That's my proposition too. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's fair, Hugh. From the date of publication, it becomes our best available information on flood risk from rivers, sea and surface water. So I think any decision makers will need to take account of it in any decisions that they're making. For site-specific planning applications, that would be via the vehicle of flood risk assessments that the applicant would be responsible for producing and in some cases updating to reflect the new data. And for local plans, the onus would of course be on the local planning authority to reflect that new data in considering how it might affect the local plan that's in the process of being prepared. It won't necessarily always mean a full SFRA update is needed. There are many situations that we've done in the past where a short addendum to an SFRA can be sufficient to make sure an inspector examining a local plan can take account of the new flood risk information. And as I've said, most places, many places at least, our understanding of flood risk won't change in a significant way. It will all come down to whether those changes coincide with prospective allocations and the like, and the significance of the change as to whether that has consequences for whether that allocation remains an appropriate one.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Just to follow up with the question, I suppose, about flood defences and funding, and it relates, I think, to the planning balance as well. There are concerns that were raised right at the very top of the questions about whether all shoreline management plans are fully funded. And just to be clear about that, my understanding, again, Sam and colleagues, is they're not, right? They're a strategy. They're not, Rachel, thank you. They're not necessarily funded. And I want to expand that to see whether or not collectively you could say that there's a question saying, well, we're creating allocations for housing before there's certainty about flood defence being funded. That relates to the planning balance question, which is really crucial about whether or not we should be allocating and approving in the context of uncertainty about resilience measures being funded in the future. That seems really crucial, whether that's coastal erosion, Rachel, or whether it's more generally. Where does flood risk and vulnerability sit in the planning balance? So if we could work from SNP funding into the planning balance in less than 30 seconds, that would be absolutely great. Rachel, perhaps you want to start on SNP.
Yeah, I'll start on SNP. So obviously SNPs provide that kind of baseline of detail of obviously where you should go, provides that direction of travel of what's happening on the coast. As you said there, Hugh, and obviously it's been replicated in the Q&A as well, SNPs aren't guaranteed funded. Obviously there's multiple mechanisms that enable or should enable that delivery of that management approach within an SNP. Is it funding? Is it politics? Is it some kind of strategy or other coastal detail in that area? So that is in essence that first baseline that it's not funded, it's not a guaranteed funding, but that direction of travel is there as that baseline. And then obviously you've got that information, and then that obviously where you'd look is in a coordination with any flood risk or any appropriate development within that area. So hopefully that explains that in less than 30 seconds.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Sam, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, on the second point of perhaps the assumptions that we make about our future ability to improve flood and coastal risk management infrastructure in relation to development, I think government's planning guidance advocates precaution, it's fair to say, about those assumptions because they are uncertain at present. That's one of the reasons why flood risk assessments and strategic flood risk assessments are tasked with assessing both present day and future flood risk. And I mentioned earlier as well the importance of understanding residual flood risks, so the consequences were flood defences to fail or be overtopped, and ensuring development is designed so those risks are safely managed. Ensuring residual risks are considered and properly mitigated does help to reduce the reliance placed on either existing or future flood risk management infrastructure.
I want to add, just as a rare moment where I would give my professional advice about development planning and development management. The current rhetoric can say one thing, but actually, Sam, what guidance says and the NPPF says is not an open door. Flood risk is well represented there as an issue, including in the footnote to the presumption in favour, and that is absolutely critical. We in our development plan allocations and decisions should not be allocating where we're not managing flood risk adequately. And I think critically the burden of proof about making development safe over its whole lifetime is a really critical test. And those tests remain there. In terms of the sequential test and the exception test, they can be difficult to apply and there's variable understanding of them. But we should be clear that in any drive for economic growth, allocating development that will be potentially uninsurable is not smart. So there's a variety of reasons, I think, to say that whatever we might understand in the mood music, actually, the bottom line is that it is climate resilience, which remains this critical foundational issue. Some quick questions just to throw in, which is there've been a number of questions on the sort of slight bewilderment about the range of advice and guidance that's being updated. In fact, I'm just sitting here thinking it'd be lovely to see that all written down on one slide. I know you made a good stab at it, Sam. The MPPG is due for an update after the NPPF. Could you please say something about what it might contain or timescales around that?
Yes, so in its response to the NPPF consultation last summer, the government has made clear that it intends to update planning guidance in response to the changes that it made on the sequential test in that December update. I think it used the language of soon. I think it's hoping to do that in short order. My understanding is that the aim is to provide greater clarity about the sequential test, about how it should be applied. And of course, that follows the change to the policy, which described how you could be exempt from the sequential test if a site is laid out in such a way that any sensitive components of the development avoid areas of current or future flood risk. So my expectation is that it will flesh out how it sees that new policy being applied in practice.
Right, and do we have a timescale for that? I know it's torturing people because everyone's under such pressure. A broad timescale?
Soon, I think, is the language used in response.
Okay.
I couldn't say any more.
Soon we'll live with it. I just want to pick up because I have great sympathy with those people doing development management in this. And just at the very bottom of this, because there are so many questions to deal with, there is a question about development management using the new EA mapping or locally prepared SFRA mapping layers. I'm going to have a stab at this, Sam, and colleagues, and you can tell me I'm wrong. It's the same proposition as development planning. You use the most up-to-date data, essentially. And that would be the most logical and rational thing to do in the planning balance. And if that happens to be in what's about to be produced on the 25th of March, rather than SFRA, then kind of so be it. Is that right?
Could I bring you in, Andrew Pattinson? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I mean, we find that with development, they could have legacy conversations. So there might have been discussions about what the flood risk was at a certain point in time. But certainly as the new information becomes available, that should be the evidence used to inform the current decisions. Obviously, where there's been a change, we'd recommend discussing that with the Environment Agency or others to make sure that the issues are understood. But as Sam has said previously, it's a risk-based approach. So just because something has changed doesn't mean it all goes out the window. It's the scale of change and the implications on development that are important.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm trusting we've managed to sort out most of the SharePoint questions, so I'm just going to try and pick up a couple more before we do the final quiz. There is a mass of quite complex and different questions relating to the way we deal with surface water in decision making in the planning balance. And we've ended, have we not, to be honest, in quite a complex process about how to treat surface water in relation to in its relationship to flood zones or not, and how we plan for it and how it's represented. And in that, I would also say there's also a bunch of questions about how often this data will be reviewed and updated in the future. So I don't know how to do this because I know you've talked about it, but if there were three principles about planning for surface water flooding under the new regime, what would they be in simple terms?
So we are in a temporary, slightly awkward position where our new surface water information is split across our digital services. We do hope as soon as we can to be able to get all the relevant information to development planning in one place on the flood map for planning, to avoid some of the observations that have been made on the chat about the confusion between the different data sets, which are suitable for use in planning, which ones aren't, whether the return period probabilities line up with the language that's used to describe them. We acknowledge that all of that is far from ideal, and the planned changes to the flood map for planning will help to address all those things in due course. Surface water flood risk, as I hope you all know, is a really serious and important source of flood risk. Planning policy and guidance has been clear for a number of years that planning policy and planning decisions need to account for all sources of current and future flood risk, based on an understanding of the likelihood and the severity of those different sources of flood risk, with an appropriate response following that understanding of flood risk. In short, surface water should be treated in a very similar way to that from rivers and sea. That is the principle of avoiding those areas in the first instance, if it's possible to do that. So the first stage of that is understanding where surface water flood risk may be now or in the future. And our hope is that our new surface water flood risk information represents a significant improvement in how we do that. If those risks can't be avoided, either by selecting the lowest risk site or laying out your site to avoid those areas, then clearly a site-specific flood risk assessment and sustainable drainage system design need to be put together to inform how that development is designed to make sure it's safe and won't increase flood risk elsewhere. For major developments, local planning authorities can, of course, call upon the expert advice of lead local flood authorities for advice on sustainable drainage system design. And government have also indicated its intention to complement the new updated NPPF policy on SUDS by updating technical standards for sustainable drainage systems, which should help to improve standardization and the quality of the sustainable drainage systems that we see in development in future.
Thanks, Sam. I mean, it is indeed a kind of movable feast and a developing feast, but as ever, there is a question just building on that, which is about the questions around groundwater flood mapping, which somebody's pointing out can be very severe. Two, where do we stand on mapping groundwater?
Yeah, so to be clear, our new flood risk data doesn't include groundwater flood risk. It covers rivers, sea and surface water. But we absolutely acknowledge that groundwater flooding can be an incredibly important source of flood risk, particularly because of its long-lasting nature in some locations. We do produce guidance in our How to Prepare a Strategic Flood Risk Assessment guidance to help local authorities to account for groundwater flood risk where it's an issue in their areas. We signpost to various sources of existing data, which should help to identify whether historic flooding from groundwater has taken place, whether a risk of groundwater flooding can be inferred from information like geological information. So do take a look at that guidance for the most up-to-date suggestions on how to account for groundwater flood risk. Finally, our Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme. There are several projects that are looking at this important source of flood risk locally and devising new innovative ways of understanding and managing that source of flood risk, which we're hoping to learn from and do more with in future.
Okay. So as we come to an end, I'm just going to try and represent ones, and this is genuinely not me not trying to catch you out, EA colleagues, because I definitely wouldn't want to do that. But there are a number of questions about how you define a functional floodplain. Where would you go for guidance on how to do that?
You want to pick that one up, Andrew? Pattinson?
I thought Sandrine won this one, if that's right.
Yeah, thank you. I have answered that question actually on the, and so hopefully the participant can see the answered tab. I'm not sure with the Q&A, if you can look on the answer tab. We have answered that question, that functional floodplain will remain the responsibility of local planning authority defined in the strategic flood risk assessment. So that's not changing at all. So all what we're showing on the flood zone when we update them on the 25th of March is that risk of flooding from that return period 1 in 30 or 30 to 1 risk of flooding, which can help local planning authority with the definition of functional floodplain. We are definitely not showing functional floodplain on our flood map.
We do intend, Hugh, to update our How to Prepare a Strategic Flood Risk Assessment guidance to better account for the new data. That's one element that we hope to provide greater clarification on in an update in due course. But that's where our best information on how to map functional floodplain currently sits on gov.uk.
That's great. So we're moving towards the end of this session. I am going to try and draw this to a close and then just do the final quiz and do some thank yous at the end of that. Colleagues from the Environment Agency, please do indicate if you'd like to say a few final words. There is a great Gary Larson cartoon with a guy at the hand up at the back of his class saying, "Can I be excused? My brain is full." I would just point out that I think that that's exactly probably how you all feel. Let's just do this last quiz and then we can point, I think, just remind us perhaps, Sam, of where some of the resources are. So the poll is a simple one. You'll be very relieved to know, how confident do you feel now in understanding the NaFRA and NERC concepts? And it just gives you 5 potential responses for that. Just while you're filling that in, and I think the same thing applies, colleagues, that just like last time, I can't see the response to this. So if you can, that would be really great. We are, I think, intensely aware that this is a very demanding environment. And the challenge with the climate crisis is that those pressures and impacts will continue driving this as being the central issue for many local planning authorities, in fact, for all local planning authorities. Nothing can happen in terms of economic development or housing without passing through this gateway of building resilience. And that is the fundamental foundation of good planning responses in the middle of the climate crisis. And by the way, there's only one direction of travel in policy, which is this is going to become more important and more significant. I think just to finish off, as we begin to bring that poll to an end, again, guys, I can't see it. What was the response? Heartening? Oh, I can see it. There we are. Well, thank you. You've done a hell of a lot better than I have. So thank you for responding to this. I want to just highlight a couple of things as we finish off. First of all, this is a collective effort. I'm aware that this puts pressure on local planning authorities and other league flood risk authorities to change and prepare in terms of where the new data brings. But that data, I think, is really important. We can't ignore the dynamic nature of climate change or the fact that the science is changing and on the whole indicating more severe impacts going forward for less carbon in the atmosphere. We simply have to deal with the fact that this creates changes to the way that we operate. There is a mass of resources which are out there. I might, Sam, just ask you to, quickly summarize again what you think the top 3 of those might be going forward. But I wanted to say from a TCPA point of view that we're also working with the agency to try to help produce those resources. Please look out for them on the TCPA website and also for training opportunities. Sam, I think there is going to be a great effort from the agency to try and communicate this, but it is challenging, isn't it? If there were just 2 or 3 milestones apart from the publication of the data in terms of communications, what would they be?
So the key thing would be to get access to the SharePoint site, the details of which have gone in the chat. That's our communication and engagement hub. There's loads of material on there already. The key things that I'll point out, the Q&A document, which is in there, is comprehensive. It contains sections on both the flood map for planning and on the National Coastal Erosion Risk Map. What we've tried to do, as we've had questions coming in from practitioners ahead of this event, we've tried to address those in the Q&A document. It's a live document. The next update is in about 2 weeks' time, and we're likely to update it again ahead of the 25th of March publication date. So do keep an eye on that. It's a live document. And as I've said, we expect to add some other key materials to that SharePoint site in coming weeks. So firstly, some more detail on the early release arrangements. They're really important that you get ready to prepare for those. Data leads, local validation teams especially need to look out for those arrangements. Also arrangements on transitional arrangements, so dealing with those live cases to make sure that we're all on the same page and communicating with each other in the right way. And finally, a bundle of materials that local authorities can use locally to brief developers. So I'd say they're the top things to look out for, Hugh.
Just a quick question from me. There's a number of people who aren't representing LPAs on this, non-planners who may be on. How do people access those resources that are on share? Are they publicly available? Sorry if it's a stupid question.
That's okay. So access to the SharePoint site is aimed at local authorities and other risk management authorities. You have to go through a registration process the first time, and usually, unless you're working for a local authority or risk management authority, you won't be granted access. But those briefing materials that we're hoping to provide to local authorities for briefing developers, it's down to each local authority how best to make those briefing materials available to developers locally, because they have those networks, those contacts that they can use to access that audience. There'll also be some briefing materials going out through our area teams as well. So if there are people on the call with a particular interest in particular sites or developments, it's better having those conversations with our local sustainable places teams if there are concerns about the changing data.
That's great. In terms of just wrapping this up, I want to say an enormous thank you to all of you for attending. It's a big agenda. We managed to get through, I hope, some useful material. In relation to the future of these resources, I don't think we can, colleagues, please, or point out if I'm wrong, I don't think we can share the Q&A, but we are going to really respectfully save it and reflect on it and try and respond to it as best we can in a conversation between the Environment Agency and the TCPA. Likewise, I think we're at the TCPA particularly keen that we can make as much publicly available material for ordinary people who are dealing with this at community level, who need to know the headlines of this and have a good understanding and a big contribution to make. But thank you to the Environment Agency team for your great presentations. Please, and also a sincere thanks to the TCPA team have also made this happen. And please look out for future resources. I'll finish as I always do by saying, given 1.5 million homes and a climate crisis, this is one of the hardest jobs in the world, right? But it is so important on a gloomy February afternoon that you recognise how important this agenda is, how important your own contribution to it is in whatever capacity you're on this call, and really how important it is that we drive solutions that give us a resilient future. So thank you all so much for attending, and look forward to seeing you on the next session.
Huge thanks all.
Thank you.